When Anthony arrived at Port's apartment, the killer administered a heavy dose of GHB, a potent drug known for its sedative effect. GHB, often used as a date rape drug, allowed Port to render Anthony unconscious quickly.
Welcome back to Crime Facts, where we dive into some of the most shocking and mind-bending crime stories in recent history. Today, we'll explore the horrifying case of Stephen Port, a British serial killer whose calculated methods and manipulation stunned the world. Port's chilling tactics went unnoticed for years as he targeted young men he met online. Join us as we unravel the terrifying details of his crimes, his attempts to evade justice, and how he was ultimately caught. Remember to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon to get notifications whenever we post a new crime story. Let's get into it.
A quiet life in Barking. Stephen Port was born in 1975 in Southend-on-Sea, Essex, but moved with his family to Barking, a suburban area in East London, at a young age. He lived a relatively quiet life and was described as shy and introverted by those who knew him. Despite his reclusive nature, he held a steady job as a chef in the city. Port's quiet demeanor and average appearance allowed him to blend in, avoiding suspicion even as his dark intentions grew. His life seemed uneventful from the outside, but inside, he was concealing a disturbing fascination with younger men. By his 30s, he began exploring online dating apps, particularly Grindr, where he could connect with vulnerable young men. This seemingly harmless hobby soon transformed into something far more sinister. The ordinary life he projected hid his carefully planned manipulations and, eventually, his deadly secrets. The move to online dating. In the early 2010, Port became heavily involved in online dating, primarily using Grindr, a popular dating app for men. He was drawn to younger men who he believed he could control and manipulate more easily. With Grindr, Port gained access to a wide pool of potential victims, many of whom were new to the app and unfamiliar with his deceptive tactics. He would often initiate contact by presenting himself as friendly, likable, and even helpful. This online persona allowed him to lure men to his apartment under false pretenses, building trust with them before revealing his darker intentions. Online, Port could experiment with different personas, trying out various ways to lure in young men without arousing suspicion. The anonymity provided by online dating apps became his most powerful tool. To unsuspecting victims, he seemed like a charming, slightly awkward man, but the reality was much darker. Meeting Anthony Walgate. In June 2014, Port connected with 23-year-old Anthony Walgate, a fashion student from Hull, on Grindr. Port lured Anthony to London by offering him money for a supposed escort job. Anthony, believing this to be a one-time transaction, traveled to meet Port, unaware of the true danger he was walking into. When Anthony arrived at Port's apartment, the killer administered a heavy dose of GHB, a potent drug known for its sedative effect. GHB, often used as a date rape drug, allowed Port to render Anthony unconscious quickly. Port was calculated in his choice, knowing that GHB would incapacitate his victim without raising suspicion. Once Anthony was fully sedated, Port assaulted him, later leaving him in a hallway near his apartment. When authorities found Anthony's body, Port claimed he had discovered him unconscious, hoping to deflect suspicion from himself. The first murder. After Anthony Walgate's death, Port staged the scene to look like an accidental overdose, hoping police would attribute it to drug misuse. When questioned, Port pretended to be a concerned bystander who had simply come across Walgate's body. Initially, police did not suspect foul play, partly due to Walgate's background as a part-time escort, which Port had highlighted. Authorities attributed the death to drug use without investigating Port's potential involvement. Though Port was charged with perverting the course of justice for lying to police, he faced minimal consequences and avoided suspicion. This initial encounter with law enforcement emboldened Port, who realized his method of drugging victims and staging their deaths could allow him to evade detection. Unfazed, he was free to continue his horrifying acts. His confidence grew, setting the stage for more planned and deadly encounters.
Staging the overdose. Port's strategy of staging overdoses became central to his plan to kill without arousing suspicion. He deliberately placed his victims in compromising positions and left incriminating items near their bodies. This tactic made it seem as though his victims had taken their own lives through drug misuse, shielding Port from immediate suspicion. Port was meticulous, positioning the bodies in ways that suggested accidental overdoses, a method he believed would deflect attention from him. In each case, he carefully cleaned up evidence in his apartment to avoid leaving traces that could link him to the crime. By avoiding any direct contact with police beyond initial statements, Port maintained a distance, reinforcing his innocence. His attention to detail worked, allowing him to kill again and again without raising suspicion. This cold, calculated approach bought him time and allowed him to continue his murderous spree unchecked. Gabriel Kovari, the second victim. Port's second victim, Gabriel Kovari, was a 22-year-old Slovakian national living in London who, like many young people, used Grindr to connect with others. In August 2014, he met Port, who offered him a place to stay while he settled into the city. Kovari, who saw Port as a friendly stranger offering help, accepted the invitation, unaware of Port's intentions. Shortly after moving in, Port drugged Kovari with a fatal dose of GHB, following the same method he had used with Woolgate. Kovari was left in a churchyard near Port's apartment, with his body positioned to look like he had died from an accidental overdose. Police once again assumed it was an isolated incident, seeing no reason to connect Kovari's death with Woolgate. This reinforced Port's belief that he could continue killing without facing consequences. The pattern continued. Port was emboldened by the lack of police scrutiny, reinforcing his strategy of targeting young, vulnerable men. He continued to use GHB, which allowed him to incapacitate his victims and control the crime scene. His method became a deadly pattern. He would befriend his victims, often promising assistance or companionship, only to betray them in the worst way possible. Port was careful to choose victims he believed would not be immediately missed by the public or press. Thinking this would help him evade detection, he followed a chillingly systematic approach, confident that police would not question his involvement. Each time he staged his victims' deaths to appear as accidental overdoses, which police attributed to London's ongoing drug issues. This method worked well, allowing Port to keep his killing spree undetected by law enforcement, leaving a trail of misdirection. Port was not only calculated in his killings, but also skilled at deflecting attention from himself through deliberate misdirection. In Kovari's case, he planted personal items and a false note to make it look like the victim had chosen to overdose. Port even reached out to Kovari's friends and family, pretending to be a concerned friend, to learn if they suspected anything. This callous approach allowed him to blend in with the victim's social circles temporarily, gaining information about potential suspicion. By planting false clues, he created confusion, further distancing himself from the investigation. Port's strategy of fabricating suicide notes added an additional layer of deception, making the deaths appear voluntary. His actions misled authorities and pacified any initial suspicions, allowing him to operate with a disturbing level of freedom. This manipulation protected him, allowing his next victim to enter his deadly orbit.
The community's growing concerns. Although police initially accepted Port's version of events, the LGBTQ+ community and families of the victims began noticing patterns in the deaths. Friends and family of the victims expressed concerns that these young men, who had promising futures, would not have taken their own lives. They pushed for a deeper investigation, suspecting something more sinister was at play. Media outlets also started picking up on the similarities between the cases, which amplified public outcry. This public pressure forced the authorities to reconsider their initial conclusions, though they were still reluctant to treat the deaths as related. The community's efforts to seek justice underscored the necessity for proper investigative practices, especially when marginalized groups are involved. These voices eventually reached law enforcement, prompting them to reopen the cases and reconsider the circumstances of each death. It was the persistence of the community that ultimately led to the downfall of Stephen Port, the tragic death of Daniel Whitworth. Daniel Whitworth, a 21-year-old chef, was Port's third victim, lured by his promises of friendship and understanding. In September 2014, Port invited Whitworth to his apartment under the pretense of companionship, gaining the young man's trust. Port drugged Whitworth in the same manner, rendering him defenseless, but this time, Port planted a fake suicide note claiming Whitworth had accidentally overdosed after feeling guilty over Kovari's death. The note further diverted attention from Port, creating a misleading narrative that the deaths were somehow intertwined without any external foul play. Police discovered Whitworth's body in the same churchyard as Kovari, yet they still failed to connect it to Port. They treated Whitworth's death as a suicide, despite several inconsistencies in the note that family and friends pointed out. Port's ability to evade suspicion once again fueled his confidence as he prepared for his next deadly encounter, the fake suicide note. Port's manipulation reached new heights with the planting of a fake suicide note after Daniel Whitworth's death. The note, which was designed to look like Whitworth's writing, suggested that he had been unable to cope with the aftermath of Kovari's death. Port crafted the note to mislead authorities and anyone close to Whitworth, believing it would divert attention away from himself. This calculated deception created a false narrative that the young chef had succumbed to guilt and despair. Friends and family, upon reading the note, were initially shocked but ultimately believed the narrative, reinforcing Port's cunning strategy. The police, interpreting the note as a sign of suicidal ideation, overlooked the connections between the deaths. By using the narrative of suicide and guilt, Port was able to keep law enforcement at bay, continuing his deadly spree without a hint of suspicion on him. The fourth victim, Jack Taylor. Jack Taylor, a 25-year-old man, became Port's final known victim in late 2015. He met Port on Grindr, where Port offered companionship and a safe place to stay. Eager to escape his troubles, Taylor accepted the invitation, unaware of the fate that awaited him. Port again used his lethal concoction of drugs, ensuring Taylor would be unable to defend himself. After drugging Taylor, Port staged his body in a nearby churchyard, just as he had done with the others. Taylor's death was treated as just another case of drug misuse, as the pattern of overdoses seemed to align with the earlier victims. Port's chilling consistency in his method enabled him to remain invisible in the eyes of the law. Each victim's death became just another statistic in the rising numbers of drug-related incidents, allowing Port to escape justice for an alarming amount of time.
CCTV footage, the key breakthrough. The investigation began to take a turn in late 2015 when authorities decided to review CCTV footage in the area surrounding the deaths. It was during this review that police spotted Port's figure on multiple occasions, coming and going from the locations where the bodies were found. This breakthrough allowed investigators to connect the dots and identify Port as a potential suspect. As they reviewed the footage, they noted Port's interactions with each victim, observing the last moments before their deaths. This visual evidence marked a significant shift in the investigation, prompting detectives to bring Port in for questioning. The police now had tangible evidence placing him at the scene of the crimes, contradicting his previous claims. This shift marked the beginning of the end for Port, as the walls of his deception began to close in on him. Connecting the dots, with the CCTV evidence in hand, police started piecing together the timeline of events leading to each murder. Detectives were able to retrace the victims' last movements, revealing how they were lured to Port's apartment. The accumulation of evidence created a clearer picture of Port's chilling modus operandi, revealing a consistent pattern of predation and manipulation. As police began to compile their findings, they recognized the need to dig deeper into Port's background, looking for any prior offenses or behaviors that might indicate a pattern of violence. This investigation opened the door to understanding Port's psyche and the dark motivations behind his actions. The more they uncovered, the more it became evident that they were dealing with a calculated and dangerous individual. This realization forced investigators to act quickly to prevent any further tragedies. The arrest. On October 15, 2015, police arrested Stephen Port at his home, bringing a swift end to his reign of terror. As officers searched his apartment, they uncovered a stash of drugs, including GHB, along with a variety of personal items belonging to the victims. This evidence was crucial in establishing Port's guilt, leading to multiple charges of murder, sexual assault, and drug offenses. Upon his arrest, Port attempted to maintain his innocence, insisting he had nothing to do with the deaths. However, detectives had already gathered enough evidence to charge him. The media quickly caught wind of the arrest, and the story of the Grindr killer began to unfold in public. As more details of his heinous acts were revealed, shockwaves rippled through the community and the nation. Port's facade began to crumble, and the truth of his horrifying crimes became increasingly evident, uncovering the evidence. In the days following Port's arrest, investigators meticulously combed through his belongings, uncovering a wealth of incriminating evidence. They discovered a collection of photographs and messages that demonstrated his manipulative behavior and attempts to lure his victims. Forensic analysis of his digital devices revealed conversations where Port would express his fantasies and intentions toward potential targets. targets. These revelations painted a chilling portrait of a man who had carefully planned each murder. The police also gathered evidence of drug use in his apartment, establishing a clear link between Port and the GHB found in each victim's system. As the case unfolded, it became increasingly apparent that Port had been operating with impunity for far too long. The mounting evidence would eventually lead to his trial, where the full extent of his atrocities would be exposed.
The trial begins. In early 2016, the trial of Stephen Port commenced at the Old Bailey in London, attracting widespread media attention. The prosecution laid out a compelling case against him, detailing the gruesome murders and the tactics he employed to lure his victims. Families of the victims attended the trial, seeking justice for their loved ones and the truth behind the horrifying events. Throughout the proceedings, the prosecution presented chilling evidence, including testimony from forensic experts and family members. Port, however, maintained his innocence, insisting that the deaths were accidental overdoses and denying any involvement in the murders. His defense argued that he was not responsible for the victims' choices and that they had willingly engaged in risky behavior. The courtroom was filled with emotional testimony, revealing the profound impact of Port's actions on the victims' families and the community. As the trial unfolded, the horror of Port's actions became increasingly apparent to all in attendance. Guilty on all counts. On November 23rd, 2016, Stephen Port was found guilty of the murders of Anthony Walgate, Gabriel Kovari, Daniel Whitworth, and Jack Taylor. The jury deliberated for just over a day before delivering their verdict, marking a significant moment in the fight for justice for the victims and their families. Port was also found guilty of multiple counts of sexual assault and drug-related offences. As the verdict was read, the courtroom erupted in emotional reaction, with family members expressing relief and grief over the loss of their loved ones. The trial highlighted not only Port's chilling methods, but also the systemic failures that allowed his crimes to continue for so long. The decision underscored the importance of justice for marginalized communities, particularly in cases involving LGBTQ+ individuals. Port's fate was sealed, and the focus shifted to the appropriate sentencing for his heinous crimes. Sentenced for life. On December 22nd, 2016, Stephen Port was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, a rare sentence in the UK reserved for the most egregious offenders. The judge remarked on the premeditated nature of Port's crimes, emphasizing the sheer brutality of his action. Port's life sentence sent a powerful message about the severity of his crimes and the impact they had on the victim's family. The courtroom was filled with emotional responses as family members expressed their relief that justice had been served. In addition to the life sentence, Port was ordered to pay restitution to the family, though it could never truly compensate for their loss. The sentencing marked the end of a long, painful journey for the victims' families who had fought tirelessly for justice. Port's actions would not be forgotten, and his case served as a rallying cry for the LGBTQ+ community in advocating for better policing and support, aftermath, and public outrage. The case of Stephen Port sparked widespread public outrage and discussions about the failures of law enforcement in addressing the concerns of the LGBTQ+ community. Many criticized the police for their slow response and lack of urgency in investigating the similarities between the deaths. The media extensively covered the trial, raising awareness about the issues of safety for marginalized individuals and the importance of proper investigative practices. Activist groups began advocating for reforms in police training, especially regarding handling cases involving the LGBTQ+ community. The horrific nature of Port's crimes led to calls for increased vigilance and support for victims of violence and abuse. The legacy of Port's case continues to resonate, highlighting the need for justice and accountability within law enforcement. The tragic deaths of Walgate, Kovari, Whitworth, and Taylor serve as a reminder of the dangers faced by vulnerable individuals and the importance of speaking out against injustice.
Stephen Port's chilling story stands as a haunting reminder of how calculated and cold some individuals can be. This case pushed the public to question justice, accountability, and the importance of vigilance in protecting the most vulnerable. Thank you for watching, and remember to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell to stay updated with more terrifying and mysterious crime stories. Until next time on Crime Facts, stay safe.